Hotline Miami is arguably the most iconic indie video game ever made, and for good reason. It's a damn good video game. Even if you don't touch indie games with a 10-foot stick, you will have still heard of Hotline Miami and perhaps even its sequel. It has such a great reputation within the gaming industry, and after playing it for myself, I can totally see why. Hotline Miami feels very unique to me. I'm someone who typically plays AAA video games, but lately they've gotten so stale that I've decided to start perusing some indie video game libraries to find a game that A, actually functions, and B, is good. So please forgive me if I say anything about Hotline Miami that is a mainstay in the indie landscape. Firstly, I love the gameplay within Hotline Miami. It takes a top-down approach to how it presents the game to the player. This is something that is far more common in indie games than AAA games, and this game in particular reminds me of the best action sequence from John Wick Chapter 4, which, side note, might be the best action film that I've ever seen. Hotline Miami is brutal and very stylish, but its style is baked into the gameplay and isn't to compensate for a lack of substance. The music in the game is often loud and bombastic and really energizes the players to go for each level mowing down enemies, and I love the graphic attention to detail in this game. You don't just kill a dude in Hotline Miami, you annihilate him. Blood splashes across the ground, heads are caved in, and people are cut in half. This game is 8-bit, yet offers some of the most detailed wounds I've ever seen in a video game. It really adds weight to the murder sprees you do in this game. I also love that the enemies in this game are actually clever. If you go around blasting everyone you've seen in the game, then you're going to get swarmed as enemies actually have ears. This isn't an arcane game, enemies will actually hear you and will sprint towards you whilst unloading their weapons, which is not what you want, as a single bullet will most likely kill you. Most likely. Sometimes you get lucky and the bullet will just cause you to leak a bit of blood here and there. I actually really like the one-hit kill system in this game, as it makes the game feel really fair, as enemies will die in one hit just like you. But every now and then when taking on multiple enemies at once, I would kill an entire room but accidentally down an enemy instead of killing them, and when I'm deciding my next course of action, he'd get back up and kill me when I'm not looking, which was a little frustrating. Especially when I was doing a mission that was more difficult than others. I also didn't like the final boss of the game. They just weren't fun for me. It didn't help that I couldn't care less about this game's story, so I didn't even really know why that person was the final boss. It wasn't a game ruiner, but I am glad that there was an epilogue after the final boss where you play as another character, otherwise I would have felt like the game ended on a sour note. Hotline Miami's gameplay loop is addicting and provides the player with so much freedom. There are so many different ways to defeat a level, and each player will best a level in their own unique ways by killing enemies in their own specific order. Before every level, the player can put on a mask which will grant them a specific perk going into that mission. This also makes every person's playthrough different and adds an additional level to the gameplay, as these masks can open up new avenues in how you dispatch your foes. For me, I'd always go with the mask that made opening doors lethal, as it was a great way to get some easy kills in the game and was a silent way of dispatching of foes. If I had to come up with a complaint about Hotline Miami, then it would be that none of the levels, bar the epilogue ones, really stick out to me, as they all sort of blend together. I don't think this is a bad thing, as the game is more about killing people in extravagantly stylish ways, but there isn't a level in this game that makes you go, man, I'll never forget that one. There is a single level in this game that isn't all about killing, and I do think it sticks out in a good way, but Hotline Miami is overall lacking in level variety. However, this isn't a problem for a game that can be perfectly summarised by the phrase, short but sweet. Hotline Miami 2, Wrong Number, is a different story. I don't think it has the same iconicness of Hotline Miami, and I don't think it was as well received, but it is still a fantastic game. In fact, I think I prefer the first half of Hotline Miami 2 to the first game. In Hotline Miami, you only play as 2 characters across the entire game, whereas in Hotline Miami 2, I think you play as more than 10 different characters across the entire game, and each of these characters feels unique in each level, and the levels themselves feel far more unique than the ones in the original. There was a lot more creativity here in the level design, and it made the game exciting to me, as I never knew what was coming in the next level. However, with this creativity comes constraints. In Hotline Miami, you were able to approach pretty much every level how you wanted to. You could use any weapon that you wanted, kill any enemy how you wanted. You had the freedom to play the game how you wanted to. Hotline Miami 2 reduces that freedom, as some levels, like the army ones, can only be played in a certain way, and it led to some frustrations in the second half of the game when things ratcheted up in difficulty, especially during the army man levels, as your character couldn't even pick up enemy weapons, which made these missions a chore to get through. And it did get to a point where the game was beginning to outstay its welcome with me, as the game was longer than the first. Since the levels are more unique and there are so many characters, the game also features a watered down version of the mask mechanic from the first game, as the characters will usually have their own individual masks or starter weapons that you can begin each level with. Unfortunately, this reduces the amount of ways you can approach a level, at least compared to the first game, and this only applies to characters with this mask mechanic. Some characters don't have anything for you to start a level with. Also, the story in this game sucks. The story in Hotline Miami 1 wasn't great either, but at least you could ignore it and just enjoy the game. The story in Hotline Miami 2 is far harder to ignore, as you're constantly switching between characters and locations, and it is just an incoherent mess. I had no idea what was happening in this game narratively. It was very weird, and perhaps I'm just too stupid to connect all the dots, but it was just a baffling story, and I kept waiting for that aha moment where everything clicked in place, but it never happened, and I was ultimately left disappointed by the story. Especially as I actually did like a couple of the characters. The police officer, the army man, the journalist, and the guy who was the second in command to Scarface. Also, the ending to this game is awful. It was a very shocking ending, only because I couldn't believe the game had decided to end at that point. Considering how the game ends, it was surprisingly a huge anticlimax. Also, of all the characters that you could end the game with, the game decided to end on one of the worst ones in my opinion. The next point is a negative for both games, but some enemy types just aren't fun to fight. I'm talking about the dogs and the big beefy dudes, especially the big beefy dudes with weapons. They were the more frustrating enemies to fight. Especially during the Army Man levels. Damn, I really hated the Army Man levels, didn't I? However, I do like Hotline Miami 2 Wrong Number. The gameplay loop here is still just as addicting as it was in the first game. The attention to detail and gore physics are of an even higher standard here compared to how they were in the first game. You get to see character entrails, heads rolling across the floor, and people slowly crawling away after surviving your initial assault. There's even attention to detail based on which character you're playing as in a certain mission. For example, in the journalist missions you can complete them without even killing anyone, going as far as to dismantle their weapons, or you can just do the usual and bludgeon everyone to death. Once again, this game's soundtrack is fantastic. I'd even go as far as to argue that it's better than the first games, and I both loved and hated how horrifying the character models were in this game. It really added to this game's unique aesthetic. I've just remembered something as well, which I didn't even script in this video, but the beginning of the game to Hotline Miami 2 also begins with a really weird tutorial scene. It's very controversial. I had heard of it before, but for some reason I forgot to mention it in the script for this video. But yeah, that really weird rape scene, it just, I don't know, man. It's hard to tell nowadays whether people are too sensitive about things or if they've got a point, but on this one I was like, yeah, they've definitely got a point with this one. It was just so weird and it didn't need to be there and it didn't make sense, and it kind of started the game off on a sour note for me as well, because I didn't like it. It was weird, and it linked to the story as well in a weird way with all the directing and how everything's like a film. I didn't get that either. Again, the story's just all weird, but I don't get why they had that weird rape moment at the start of the game. It did nothing for the game, and it was just a bad decision. But all in all, despite both games having issues, I think both Hotline Miami and Hotline Miami 2 Wrong Number are great games deserving of your time, and I believe that Hotline Miami is justifiably an iconic video game.